Rights Amendment on both the federal and state level has sparked a great deal of controversy and debate. All too often the debate has been hampered by lack of information or a basic misunderstanding of the amendment. The ERA is a change in the position of women and, to a lesser extent, others of minority status. The Federal Equal Rights Amendment states, "Equality of rights under the law shall not be abridged by the United States or by any other state on account of sex," since the 14th Amendment has been interpreted to outlaw discrimination against minorities. The federal ERA refers only to sex discrimination. In contrast, the Massachusetts ERA provides equality to both women and minorities, prohibiting discrimination on the basis of sex, race, color, creed, or national origin. Tonight, Say Brother will examine the federal and state ERA as it particularly relates to minority women. We have with us Gracia Hillman, who is the administrative aide to the Legislative Black Caucus, and Mr. Ted Landsmark, who is the executive director of the Contractors Association of Boston. I would like to direct my first question to you, Gracia, and that is, if the ERA does pass in Massachusetts on the November referendum, what effect do you think that will have?
Well, there are some existing laws that do provide for equality with regard to sex and race and creed and national origin. But the Equal Rights Amendment will prove to strengthen some of the existing laws, either under family law, your employment, education, but mostly with regard to jurisdiction that the state has. In other words, the Equal Rights Amendment is not going to have an effect on private institutions, including private educational institutions, even though they do receive federal monies. But it will prove to strengthen some, and it will prove to serve to give some equality for women and minorities under family laws and education.
Okay, in terms of thinking of minorities, one thing that comes to mind is that the question of minorities, where we've been dealing with affirmative action for the last couple of years, will that suddenly bring about some type of competition between white women and minority men? Because it seems that currently they've just been able to get their foot in the door and make some headway. And I'd like to direct that question to Ted.
Well, I think that there's very little question that in the past, affirmative action has involved the creation of hiring goals and timetables, and has involved establishing quotas for the employment of minorities on jobs where normally they wouldn't have been employed. Now, it's been suggested by some people that if an Equal Rights Amendment were to be passed in Massachusetts, the quotas would remain essentially the same, the goals and timetables might remain essentially the same, and that third world minority men would suddenly find themselves in competition for jobs with white women. It's been suggested partially because of what people see in state government, where, for example, white women have been hired in more policymaking positions than minority men have, and where the governor and other policymakers have been able to say that because they're hiring those white women who have tended to be by and large upper class and upper middle class women, that they're acting affirmatively to bring into the state government people who traditionally would not have been there. So there's no question but that there's a possibility that competition between the groups can take place. And one of the reasons that we are particularly concerned to join with those persons who are now organizing on behalf of the ERA in this state is to be sure before the amendment is passed that coalitions are formed which will act to prevent that kind of competition from taking place and to assure that both minorities and women will benefit from equal treatment under the law.
Okay, Gracia, as the ERA reads now, if it is passed, will it benefit minority women significantly?
I think that there's going to be a situation. I don't know that the benefit of the ERA is going to significantly affect any minority, speaking of ethnic minority group, because the emphasis has been on sex, and that's shown by the federal ERA, even though the state ERA would include provisions for equality for other minority groups. I don't know that the emphasis is going to fall there, because it's basically the same situation as with the minority men, where the minority women have a twofold kind of discrimination they faced. Number one is the discrimination on their race, be it black or Spanish speaking, and the second is discrimination against sex. So that they're entering this battle kind of fighting two phases of it, whereas white women are fighting the sex aspect of it.
Okay, when we think in terms of the effects for all women on the issues of family law, property, employment, and criminal statutes, let's just take a look at family law. How will the ERA affect family law in the areas of alimony, child custody?
Well, one of the things that's important to bring out is that the ERA is not going to significantly change every aspect of, say, the family law. For instance, child custody will remain the same, which basically is that child custody is granted to the spouse that is thought by the court to be able to be the best provider, so that you're not talking that the woman has or the mother has the automatic rights to the child, but if in fact it can be proven that the father would be the best provider, he would gain child custody. If you're talking about when a woman enters marriage, there seems to be a common law that says the spouse or the person who has purchased the property has the right to it. Then the Equal Rights Amendment would prove to provide that the woman, upon entering marriage, has rights to property that she owns, that she has purchased. And in the case of a divorce, that the property would be divided such that the woman should not necessarily think that she's going to walk out of this gaining all the property, and a man would not feel that he is going to lose everything, but in fact it would be divided if they can't make a mutual agreement between the two parties. It would be divided upon who has made the investment, who has made the actual purchase. I think one of the things that's important to bring out is that some people have raised questions regarding why does Massachusetts need to pass an Equal Rights Amendment to its state constitution if in fact the federal government is addressing the same problem. And one of the clear things is that the federal government amendment has to be ratified by all states, and that there's a process that goes through, which means that it could possibly be 1981 before the Equal Rights Amendment could be implemented because of federal law, whereas when this question comes on the November ballot, Massachusetts will be able to implement this law immediately in the state with regard to state government and what the state governs. And the legislature is already beginning to address itself to review some of the existing laws in Massachusetts that could in fact be discriminatory should the ERA pass.
Now, I know on the federal level, if the ERA, if there is an amendment and it will not be instituted for 2 years, that doesn't hold true in Massachusetts. Will it go into effect immediately?
Right. With the state law, the ERA would take effect immediately after the elections in November of this year, if the people vote that they do want an Equal Rights Amendment to the state constitution.
Okay, so essentially what you're saying, even in Massachusetts, the ERA is a change in the status of women. And despite the fact that minorities may benefit from some of the things that are happening, that
sure.
Women stand to benefit most.
Oh, sure.
Oh, no question of that.
Okay, thank you.
You know, they ask me which is more difficult, being black or being a woman. But if somebody is steadily pounding on your head, it really makes no difference if you're woman, man, male, female, black, white, it still hurts.
Flo Kennedy is a lawyer, a noted feminist. She's been extremely active in women's rights and women's issues. She's been the founder of the National Feminist Party in New York. Flo, as I said, you have a record that precedes you. Let's talk about the ERA amendment on a national perspective. If the ERA amendment is passed nationally, how do you feel that all women stand to benefit from that?
Well, I think it'll be a victory over right-wing racist sexism, and I feel that that right wing is what we really ought to be concerned about. Because you see, the right wing church-dominated Pig-o-cracy, which really embraces most of what I call the government and business delinquents and much of the media, is the real enemy, are the real enemies. And I think that the Equal Rights Amendment is being covered over by media for the most part. You can compare the amount of coverage to, say, baseball or some jock activity with the coverage of the Equal Rights Amendment. And you find that jockocracy gets 5 hours Saturday and Sunday, watching the balls roll into the hole and get batted across the fence and chased after and people falling on balls. And yet if you say, let's do something on the ERA, they say, we did something on the Equal Rights Amendment. So it'll be a triumph over all those aspects of a pathological society that don't want any changes that will affect the degree of racism and sexism in our country. So the Equal Rights Amendment is simply a symbolic victory. It's like winning a hill in North Korea or Vietnam that has nothing on it particularly and has no mining potential, but it is a victory in that it was their territory and we took it away. Now, I think that's the main thing, and it depends on political pressure as to whether there are any changes, whether it relates to women, black women, Puerto Rican women. They're all niggerized communities, and whether they are women, prostitutes, housewives, madonnas, whores, welfare mothers, or whatever, they're constantly niggerized by government, business, the media, and the church. So naturally, the little Equal Rights Amendment is not going to change all that any more than the Civil Rights Acts changed everything as far as racism is concerned.
What do you think will change that? As you spoke about the factions of women who've been what you call, quote, niggerized, how do you think that these types of stigmas can be erased?
Well, I think that when you get a law in a country that purports to be about law and order, and then there are no respondent changes by the Pig-o-cracy or the Pig-o-crats, then, of course, people get angry. And that's what happened in 1954 when we got a decision that said that schools should be integrated. And here we are 22 years later, and you have the red, white, and blue contingent, incidentally led by white women and very little opposed by feminist groups. The red, white, and blue contingent, I might suggest, is the red-necked white trash and blue collars who are objecting to the implementation of that Brown decision from 1954. But you will get backlash, as I see it, and theoretically, if the women lie down and take it, as we are wont to do, then I would suggest it could conceivably be worse. Certainly in 1954, you didn't have white trash marching in Boston to keep black kids from sitting in a poor white trash neighborhood school. So you see, you cannot guarantee that a liberation struggle will always make it better for the people that are niggerized unless they get off their haunches and continue to fight for some kind of fairness and equity.
So what you're saying is, despite all the yelling and ranting and raving about sisterhood, 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 are you saying that women who are involved in the movement have to deal with feelings that they have of racism? And I'm referring right now to white women.
Well, yes, I feel that it's true that there is a quantum of racism in the feminist community in that it's a sort of do-nothing attitude. And I think most of the ranting and raving is on the part of those movements that are not feminists, such as the Stop ERA movement that rants and raves and has all the time on television that they can give people like Phyllis Schlafly, because every time you talk about an issue of feminism, you somehow have to have someone that's saying women are not human beings or wanting to be a human being is not ladylike. So I suggest that although there is racism in the feminist community, it's obviously at a much lower level than it is in either the anti-abortionist community, where you've got even black women like Dr. Jefferson who are putting all kinds of obstacles in the ability to terminate a pregnancy, which is the largest reason for dropouts in among high school black youngsters. So it's not by any means a simple issue.
I'd like to come back to that point. Now, I had the opportunity to go to the NOW convention in Philadelphia last October. And one of the things that I saw happening there was the emergence of what is now called the majority caucus, who won 2/3 of the vote at the convention. And since that time, there's been a split in the National Organization of Women. How do you think that split will affect the majority of the membership who are interested primarily in issues of child care, equal access to credit, and improved income?
Well, I think that was a power struggle over nothing. It's certainly true that you do have a sort of right-wing group within the feminist community, as you do in any struggle group. It's what I call horizontal hostility, and people like Betty Friedan can lead up those places, whether that group, whether in Mexico City or in Philadelphia. And they are more or less anti-third world women, although they purport not to be. However, you didn't have a chance to go to any South Boston meetings of women against the black children over there, and that's where you'll find the real enemies as far as women are concerned, in my opinion. So that what I would have to say would relate to the racist women who are committed to fight all women, who certainly would be very comfortable with the Stop ERA, Stop Abortion, and Stop black kids coming to school. So that as far as I'm concerned, you might be able to teach the feminists to cut down on their racism, but when you have people that are following the Pampers Wallaces and the Wrinkles Reagans and the Louise Day Hickses of this world and the Irene the Idiot McCabe, then you have a different kind of enemy, and I personally am not as concerned about horizontal hostility within the communities as in women and the prostitutes and the feminists as I am to worry about the banks, the insurance companies, the trade associations, the major unions that are really funding the fight against the Equal Rights Amendment.
So are you suggesting that despite the fact that women have a variety of political, economic, and social priorities, that they should kind of step out of those priorities for a minute and look at where the real oppression is coming from? It seems to me that you're saying that women aren't recognizing that regardless of what their status is.
Yes, I think so, but I even like better what Ted Landsmark was saying about the coalition among the niggerized groups in New York, for example, where incidentally the Equal Rights Amendment failed at the state level, both New York and New Jersey, because you see, the right wing have it together. You see, they're running, for example, an Ellen McCormick on the anti-abortion ticket. But you see, we don't have it together. And in New York, we have the Coalition Against Racism and Sexism, and it sort of sounds like Ted Landsmark's idea is the same, because we have Fight Back, the construction black people, the lesbian feminist liberation, the coyote groups, the prostitutes organizations, all the gay community, men and women, all fighting to pass the Equal Rights Amendment. And I think that coalition of people ready to take anti-establishmentarian positions is stronger than our just going off in different directions, all too weak to do anything except hate each other and try to trip each other up.
Okay, well, taking into consideration priorities and objectives, what can you say realistically will happen, or the chances are of getting these kind of niggerized or oppressed groups together?
I think it depends a lot on whether feminists are prepared to take a stand against the right-wing women, especially right-wing white women, because it's certainly clear that they are not going to be in coalition with the feminists to pass the Equal Rights Amendment. So I think it's important for black women who don't fight actively in racism, against racism, as most Boston women don't seem to have been fighting. I haven't heard it anyway. Then I would suggest that, yes, the black women as well as the non-white women from the Native American communities, from the Spanish-speaking communities, should all ally to pass the Equal Rights Amendment unless they're working against racism. I just think it's important to wind up by saying that I think racism is to sexism as cancer is to a terrible toothache, and neither one is to be taken lightly, but obviously cancer kills you.
Well, can I ask this one last question? In terms of coalitions forming, did you see this type of thing happening at the International Women's Affair in Mexico City?
Well, yes, it happened, but also there was a certain amount of catfighting, but the media played up the catfighting, of course, and it ignored all the positive things. Many positive things did take place, and coalitions were formed.
Thank you. We'll be back to discuss that later in the show.
The women's libbers want to get out their kitchens. Well, you know what? I want to get out their kitchens, too.
The Massachusetts Equal Rights Amendment will be appearing on the November referendum. Here to discuss with us the implications for minority women and their reactions to that amendment are Kay Gibbs, Marcia Hubbard, and Thelma Watson. I'd like to throw out a question, and I think anyone can react to this, and that is, what do you see that the amendment will do for minority women? Or how will it affect you as a minority woman?
I think that minority women probably stand to benefit more than anyone else in some sense from the passage of the State Equal Rights Amendment, but that the concern really is whether or not it will benefit the minority community of the third world community as a whole, and that while the minority community probably has no choice but to support the ERA, there's some real concern about what kind of a situation is going to be set up, assuming that the amendment is ratified, in terms of competition among groups who ordinarily should have shared interests around things like jobs and other kinds of things to which we don't presently have access, and that minority women in a situation where the law now says that women are also to be given equal treatment under the law will suddenly be a commodity in the job market, in the sense that they will be a double minority, and that we have to be very careful in our support of the amendment to make it clear that after the amendment is passed, that we talk about a situation in which there are two jobs available for two disenfranchised groups, which are third world people and white women, rather than a situation in which those two groups compete for one job, and that we essentially now begin to impact on the dialogue on the Equal Rights Amendment in such a way that it is viewed as a movement of people who do not have power, of which there are several groups, who probably make up the majority both in the state and in the country, because who has the power now are white males and large corporations, and that we have to construct a situation in which the rest of us, who are the majority, transfer that power to ourselves, that the Equal Rights Amendment represents a vehicle to do that.
Okay, when we think about input, what type of input have minority women had to this point? You know, what usually happens, it seems that women, and I'm talking about white women at this point, have aligned themselves with minorities in the sense that there's a concern that we're fighting in terms of equality for the same types of situations. And I don't know the extent that minority women have had input in. And one of the general feelings is that minority women, should the Massachusetts ERA pass, don't really see that they'll derive any benefits.
I think that that's a legitimate concern. I also think that if we look at the last year and the people who have been spearheading the ERA, that there is reason to believe that unless they take a 90-degree turn right now to include minority women on every committee they have, at every level of functioning that they do, that there's no reason to believe that they're going to include us at the next step, which is implementation of the civil rights that will include sex. One has to look right now at what is happening at the state level in politics. One has to look that the governor presently is substituting with great ease white women for what otherwise he might be he might be moved to have black women or black males in top policymaking state jobs. We're not seeing that. In fact, we're seeing that we're losing ground at that level, and I'm not hearing anyone, least of all white women, coming out and saying, wait a minute, the balance is falling. There's no longer a balance here in terms of racial minorities and white female minorities. And that I think is a legitimate concern.
Are you saying that, then do I hear you saying that in terms of any linkage with racial minorities, that for women, white women, it's a convenient one?
I don't think that I understood your question.
In terms of the question of oppression. You know, we've been oppressed.
Certainly. Because I would go so far as to say that the present ERA women who are pushing it, the coalition, is more representative of white, middle class, and upper middle class, well-educated women, as opposed even to the low-income white woman. So that you don't find either racial minority women in there in significant numbers, nor white, low-income women. So what you're left with is a very well-educated, upper middle-income women, and they might want a job today, and they might go home or to Europe for a year next year. So they have nothing to lose we have everything to lose.
So what you're saying is you feel that, excuse me, you as a minority women and minority women generally and minorities have more at stake in supporting an amendment like this.
I think so.
I think it's also interesting to note that up until the last maybe 2 weeks or so, the amendment has been publicized very highly as a sex thing, as opposed to making the public aware that it is also responding to a need for anti-discrimination laws against race, creed, color, national origin, and it hasn't been done to this point. The other thing is that I think there have been some public opinions that if the race part of the amendment is publicized, that it will be equated with busing, and then it is doomed to fail. If we are talking about an amendment that will aid in discrimination against blacks, Spanish-speaking, Native Americans, and Orientals, we're also talking about including them into the movement, and that hasn't been done.
How do you think that can be done?
I think the public needs to know that the ERA, the state ERA amendment, does talk about those groups, and that there is should be some response from the community in how they feel about it.
See, the dialogue needs to change. That the problem is that the dialogue around the state ERA is that it's an amendment to the Constitution that will prohibit discrimination against sex. Very few people know that it also is designed to prohibit discrimination against race. What that means to me is that the people who are involved in the movement to ratify the ERA are using it as an organizing tool to organize white women, and that when the amendment passes, the white women will be organized, and they will be potentially moving against the third world community in such a way to take whatever jobs and other things that we've been able to get from the people that oppress us, and that the way in which the movement potentially could be a tool for organizing all kinds of people who do not have power, who, in my theory, constitute the majority of the people in this state, and yet it's not being used as that kind of a tool. And that our view is that we have to make sure that dialogue gets raised.
Okay, are you suggesting that without that dialogue, that on the part of white women, that this is a conscious thing on their part?
Oh no, I think that they don't know anything except representing their own interest. I mean, it's the question that racism is the first operative in our society, and if we're talking about white women, then we're talking about people who are also racist by definition. They can't help it. They never thought of including third world people in the movement, either men or women, that therefore they're going to represent their own interest as they have done. They will continue to do that as they have done up to now, and that we have an obligation to make sure that does not happen.
So agree or disagree, what you're saying is whatever should happen ultimately with the amendment, that minorities need to get a toho into what's happening. They need to dialogue. They need to meet, make their feelings known.
And that it's a great organizing tool for all kinds of all kinds of people to organize around transfer of power.
Okay. Has there been some type of legitimacy in excluding women of color?
Legitimacy?
Yeah. I mean, in terms of when we get down to priorities and objectives. I think you may have touched on that just a bit. In terms of maybe as a white middle-class woman, as Marcia pointed out, my goals and my priorities may be just a little bit different than, let's say, a minority woman. And conceivably, my objective or my procedure for attaining those might be a little different.
Well, let's hope not. I mean, let's hope that all of our goals are the same, and that is the equality of human rights, so that if indeed there are different goals and objectives, that underscores the concern that we have about what the ERA will ultimately accomplish.
Thank you.
Some soft brown words for you. Feel them. Sweet patchouli, can't find no tune, no honeysuckled sigh of the wind, soft or gentle, no ocean roar in the cup of my hands, no smoke signal of the eyes, or breath sucked through silky smiles, sly, sad, or shy enough to speak my love for you. Better left, enough said, unsaid, and understood. Another poem, a love poem. Share this with me. Erotica 1, or Treatise on the Black Lagoon Before the Creatures Came. Love in the bath is seldom premeditated, but creative in its utter urgency. The clean and the sacred, soap and water make bathroom sex the most revered of all primal pleasure rituals. Sandscapes and picture frames slide down walls, and mirrors fogged with the mist of dawn obscure all reflection. The mat becomes a bed of moss, and we embrace limbs snaked around glistening limb, my tongue a live bird of paradise winging through your tropical rainforest. Somewhere between my lips you are lost in the bright green foliage of your fantasy. Nothing exists beyond the flutter of kisses and the splash of sweet rain on our faces. Your hands are the first sacred verses ever chanted, and I am wrapped in the poetry of your touch. An appetite for pomegranate you satisfy with mine, which is tender, fragrant, bursting, sticky, sweet to the taste. The gentle journey, a twisted trail of arrowhead, a slow motion stalk through coils of jungle vines, the search for the golden city hidden at the mouth of a cave. Around and around eyes roll and sink in the whirlpool at the top of your head, and finally you are sucked into the quicksand of my thighs. I can no longer claim my soul. I am possessed. I speak in tongues and dance forgotten dances with familiar gods. I am willing to die here and now on the altar of your love. Flames lick each vertebrae. I am consumed in a blazing sun of glory. I exist without form or consequence. My only memory is your voice echoing a name that once was mine. We are one perfect moment, a single note resounding in the void. I never want to speak or move again. Sometime after the great deluge, waters running in the tub, and the wind was really just a fan. I sense my breath and your heart pounding against my chest. The smell of burning coffee blends with milk and honey. Then that distant banging sound like drums rolling off the hills, and a familiar little voice squeezed insistently through a keyhole. "Mommy, what you doing in there? Open the door, I got a pee-pee."
Frida Garcia is a member of the Spanish-speaking community, and she has been very active and involved in the issues that affect the community, and very concerned about those issues as they affect women in the Spanish community. Frida, how are you?
Fine.
Would you just share with us what some of the basic concerns are of Hispanic women in regards to the Equal Rights Amendment and women's liberation?
Well, I'm not sure, and I'm going to try to speak primarily of the Hispanic women in Boston, rather than, because I think that represents a different kind of problem than, say, New York, where you have a couple of generations. I mean, Boston, Hispanic community is almost really one generation old, and not even that. I mean, the major group has only been here about 5 years or so. So you're talking about women who have been born and raised on the island, on the islands, if we're going to talk about the broader community, and who come here and are really dealing with the crisis of two cultures, all right? So I'm not quite sure that as a group that they are very aware or very concerned about an issue like the fact that there's going to be a referendum and that there is an Equal Rights Amendment pending right now. What does concern me, and I think what I want to really talk about is that I think as a group that they've been programmed in a particular way, and that program, the message has been very, very clear and maybe a little bit more emphatic than, say, for women who have grown up in this country and have been exposed to a different reality. I think that the program that we are raised with as women, which is very, very definitely, it's more than just second-class citizenship as women. I mean, the expectations of really not working and not making any decisions for yourself, of the ideal situation of going from your father making the decision to your husband making the decision and your sons making the decisions for you. And then the reality of what life is really about, which is very, I mean, the gap there is enormous.
So what you're saying in terms of what the cultural experience is that a woman may conceivably grow from childhood into womanhood, not really thinking about having to deal with what I define as the 3 Ds, death, desertion, or divorce.
That's the message, and of course the reality is very different. But still, all the preparedness and everything is geared toward that. And my feeling is that we need every single thing possible to try to overcome that. And if that happens to be to have in existence and on the law book an amendment that says and emphasizes the fact that women have rights, then I think it's important. Even if we're almost talking about a symbolic thing. And that it might be years before we as a group really get involved and will raise issues that will really have an effect on us. And I think that's the point from where I'm coming at, that I'm just overwhelmed by this duality of the two cultures and the fact of women having to be raised here and still sort of acting as if it is possible to, to go through life and not have to make decisions. That isn't very real.
What you're saying is in terms of making moves, let's say from a particular island or a particular Hispanic country, and having to deal with what culturally you were exposed to there, and then trying to integrate yourself into the American culture, that there are still adjustments that women have to make from what they've known traditionally as opposed to what they find here.
Yeah, and also that I think it is still possible, say in a Puerto Rico or in a Dominican Republic, that, the male members of your family are going to assume some roles. I think once you're in this country that is not a possibility at all.
Can you elaborate on that, please?
Well, I mean that the extended family it begins to deteriorate in this country as a result of distances of everything. I mean, just that's not a part of the American culture, and so that if you do find yourself living in this country, you sooner or later will find yourself having to stand on your own 2 feet and make decisions for yourself, and so that it's important that we as a group begin to face that. And be helped to face that with as many symbols, even if they're only symbols, as possible. I mean, and that's the point because I'm not kidding myself that the ERA is going to make a difference. Where we are on the economic ladder. I mean, we're the absolute bottom. We're not talking about competing probably even for secretarial jobs. If you're talking about us as a group here in Boston. So I mean that, and I think that's important to say that because that isn't. I have no illusions about that, but I do think that not having that law on the books is important to try to get our heads moving in another direction.
Important, excuse me, important in that it will establish the fact that for Hispanic-speaking women and probably make them aware of the fact that as women they do have rights. But right now there just seem to be other priorities and objectives that women feel, Hispanic women feel that they must deal with in terms of their politics their economy and their social situation.
Yeah, and well, earlier in the program, I think it was Flo Kennedy mentioned again about the fact that 20 years ago, the law, the desegregation, and where are we? It's 22 years later. And again, I don't think that people really thought things were going to change overnight, but we're not going to go back to what it was before 54. And for the same reason, I think that even if you know it's not going to affect you immediately and that there are other battles and that the racist battle is much more important and it still has to be fought, I still think that that law needs to be on the books.
Thank you.
I've been living in this country a long time, and I ain't never seen anything separate and equal.
Okay, the topic of equal rights and women's liberation does evoke quite a bit of controversy. If the Equal Rights Amendment is passed, can you tell me what benefits do you think minority women can derive from that?
I think I'd like to answer the question in terms of what benefits are going to derive to those people who are supposed to get benefits from it. And I think that it's, from my view anyway, important for people to understand what the ERA is and what it is not. My own judgment is that the ERA in Massachusetts is primarily an organizing tool, and that for our purposes, we have to be worried about who's getting organized around that, the passage of that amendment, so that whoever gets organized will impact on what happens after it's passed. So that I think that less the question of what, for example, benefits will accrue to minority women is what kind of negative benefits might accrue to the third world community in general, or what kind of benefits will accrue to whom, so that essentially the ERA is an organizing tool, and that after it's passed, assuming that it is, then people will move to do a number of things, and that the concern is that we be organized to move to do our thing. The second thing I think that's important is that just as the Brown versus Board of Education decision, it took 22 years to only begin to implement that decision, that likewise, if the ERA is passed, I think that we still have a situation where we have a lot of institutional racism and sexism that the passage of that amendment is not going to alter. And so that it's critical that we begin to address ourselves to the larger question of what are we going to do, ERA or not, about dealing with the transfer of power, the coalition of the oppressed people, and that sort of an issue.
Now, I heard you raise one thing that Flo touched on earlier, and that was the question of coalitions. And what I'd like to ask you, Flo, is we didn't have an opportunity to get into it in depth. What kinds of things can be done in terms of coalitions? Is it best to organize around issues? And if that's the case, what types of issues can groups organize around?
Well, I think organization is terribly important, but I also think technique is important. I think it's important to put the pressure in the testicular area, in those areas where pressure will have the greatest impact and meaning. And I think organization just to march in the street or just to enter the suites is never going to be enough. I think also the feminist movement in dealing with the ERA, Equal Rights Amendment, made some tactical blunders. I think they made tactical blunders in recruiting minority women. I think they tried to recruit minority women by teaching them that black and non-white men were sexist or macho or whatever. But I think it's important for white feminists to recruit non-white women by opposing the racism of their white quote-unquote sisters. And that's a difficult thing. And I think when they recognize that black people don't have white children and white people don't have black children and Chicanos don't have black children unless they intermarry, they will begin to understand that we require them to separate themselves from and oppose the racism in white women as much as they do the racism in white men. I think it's necessary to recognize that the feminists have tried very hard to recruit non-white women, and they're very sensitive to that. But the lack of opposition to the racism of the women's community and the focus on the sexism of the male communities of non-white groups has caused a kind of schism. I think it's also important to understand the shortage of non-white men, be it Native Americans, black people, Spanish-speaking people, is such that black women are not so anxious to deal with feminism with white women because the shortage of black men is even shortened by the fact that many feminists, being angry at the white men, want to go out with the black men. And in a way, it shows their lack of racism, but in another way, it reduces the number of black men around. So it is certainly not a simple issue. I like the National Black Feminist Organization because that is a way for the black women to organize around feminism without necessarily having to deal with the white feminists. But I do feel that the tactical errors made by feminists will be corrected, and I think they will understand that the only way they can pass the Equal Rights Amendment is to relate to other oppressed groups, and that means they've got to take a strong stand on racism, not just of white men and the white male-dominated institutions, but also of white women.
Okay. The idea of coalition and racism keeps evolving in the conversation. And if we're thinking about, realistically, about coalition, it seems to me that, number one, the issue of racism has to be addressed. I don't think that we can avoid that. But still, you have, among minority women, there's the feeling that if the question of feminism addressed is primarily done on the basis of middle-class women. And if minority women are interested, if they're going to make inroads, there are some things that they have to do, but somehow they feel becoming involved, their issues and their priorities will be usurped. So it doesn't really make that much difference if we get involved or not.
No, absolutely not. It does make a difference. It does. And I think that to categorize it as racism is correct in one way, and yet it's erroneous. It's both. It's a class struggle, and it's also, because it is a class, it has to be racial also.
Here, here.
Consequently, what we're seeing and what we're objecting to is the fact that there seems to be, for a variety of reasons in this particular state of Massachusetts, an effort by a given class of people to say to racial minorities, to say to lower class white women and others that are caught in between those categories, to say, let me temporarily put your rights right here while I fight for mine. And then, of course, I'll come back and make sure that you didn't get stepped on. But there is no assurance, because if they're willing to put ours aside temporarily, they can do away with them totally. And so what we're saying is, it's not that we're not interested. It's not that we don't trust you. It's that if we get there to the same goal together, we have that much more power, that much more say. And that is what we're seeing. We're seeing what I consider to be a barrier, a class barrier, that doesn't exactly say you cannot come in, but by its nature does not pull you in. And that, I think, yes, I think we have to be part of it at every level. And everyone who sees themselves as a humanist, as someone who's concerned, has got to stop and say, those women in the black community, the Chinese community, the Spanish-speaking community are right. You've got to get together and march, or they're going to become victims of that battle as well.
So what you're saying in terms of minority women, that if inroads are to be made, they've got to become involved, they've got to voice their concerns, and they've got to become involved in the power-making process.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
The dues that daddies pay. When it was finally finished, I shelved the joy of cooking high out of reach and began dining alone with an unprecedented extravagance I could hardly afford. I threw away his records and watched my shows without compromise. I lost contact with his mother and felt relieved of that obligation. I had my son to myself and sent him to daycare so I could do my thing. I stopped calling girlfriends who sang, "I told you so, I told you so," from the pedestals of their tentative marriages. I went to the movies in the afternoon, but never stayed to see the pictures end. I added gin to my shopping list and sat around a smoky table with crazy ladies plotting treason in the kitchen. We never traded recipes anymore. We swapped our sex lives. I was a danger to strangers and cleaned house with local lames who claimed they were in love. I posed, New York City slick, and never let on. I used to wear an apron and bake banana bread. A few months ago, I met him at Park Street en route to Harvard. He was wearing the same old army khakis I'd never have to iron again, perpetually prepared for revolution. Just for old time's sake, I scribbled the new address, prefacing my maiden name with Ms. "Do you think," he asked, "I can stop by sometime?" "To see my son, of course." "Oh, I'll be very busy for the next 2 weeks. Let me write you in my book for June." "To see your son, of course." That afternoon, I thought about changing the sheets, just for old time's sake, but decided if those sheets are good enough for me, they are certainly good enough for him. I absolved my sins with bubbles and brandy and jumped when the doorbell rang. I checked my hair before I swung the door open with an attitude in the hands on my hips. Now I had him. In my house, drinking my wine, listening to my music, and if you don't dig it, take your black ass elsewhere, damned if I care.
While women's liberation and equality does touch some sensitive nerves among minority women, Historical precedents and cultural background often make these women feel that their goals and priorities differ. We hope you have found the issues addressed useful and informative. Thank you and good night.
We are Africans by choice, Americans by investment.